Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Simply Trade podcast news roundup. My name's Annick, and today I have a fun little segment for you. I'm here with Grant Sernick. He is from Third Wave. He's been on the podcast a few times, right? Which that's always nice because he knows how things are going, but he has not been on with me. So here you go. There's always a first time. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here again.
So I just want to touch on real quick, what are the headlines this week? Kind of the breaking trade news. Again, I'm telling you, there's no breaking trade news. I think the only breaking trade news that we really got this week was that EU is delaying their kind of comeback towards the US, and they just are waiting for negotiations to happen. So yeah, that's really it. But I just want to go over what we've been experiencing, which is USMCA exemption, which is extended until April 2nd. And April 2nd is approaching. So I don't know. We'll probably be hearing. There's probably something is going to happen in the next few weeks. Okay, this is a crazy update. There's a Tariff price surge, which is like energy drinks. This is crazy, and this will impact industries ranging from pharmaceuticals to energy drinks. So there you go. New Section 232 investigation. So there has been initiated a investigation into imports of copper and timber lumber with deadline set for April 1st. Also coming up, April is going to be fantastic for the news. Steel and aluminum tariffs are still there. That's been here to stay. And then reciprocal tariff program is basically coming up too, which is April 2nd. And I think the US and the EU are currently negotiating. We don't really know. We're trying to hear from them. I mean, we need some information, right? And again, I'm gonna start with this. It seems like the information we get takes a while to get to us, right? We don't really know what they're negotiating right now. We don't know what they're talking about. They're not giving us anything, no updates. How is it for you in your sector to kind of deal with that kind of unknowingly, I guess?
There's things seem to be moving slowly, or there's no new news. Like the speed at which we have been moving over the last, 2 months has been sort of like totally breakneck. And you're right. Where we are today is basically somewhat of a holding pattern, if you will, insofar as April 2nd is going to be, April 1st, April 2nd is going to be a big day. As that was the deadline provided for the analysis of trade and the reciprocal tariffs that are going to be announced, which is sort of like supposedly this global review, U.S. and the world trade and what that means and how tariffs, or what Trump is calling reciprocal tariffs, are going to be applied. What that really is that for goods that are imported into the U.S. Some are free, have a duty rate of 0. Some have a duty assessed against it. This is defined by the HTS code of the United States. But every country has a similar tariff code. And what Trump's big concern is that the U.S. tariffs certain sets of goods coming in very low, and that other countries have a much higher duty rate on things that the U.S. produces. So as an example, and the one that's always used, is European cars coming into the United States has a duty rate of 2.5%.
Germany is bad. They're like in the worst place right now. I'm like, well, you better buckle up.
U.S. cars going into Germany are 10%, and the point is well, if fair is supposed to, or if trade is supposed to be free and fair, that doesn't seem very fair, and so the reciprocal tariff on Germany or Europe for U.S. made automobiles would be 7.5%, right? In theory, but that applies very broadly across the world, and the U.S. is a very large trading nation, and so every country is going to have some set of goods that is seemingly unfair, where the U.S. imports at a certain rate, and if the roles are reversed, then the rates would be somewhat different. And so the point of these reciprocal tariffs, or excuse me, the analysis of the reciprocal tariffs is to figure out what to do, how to do it, right? And it's very unclear today what the U.S. is going to do. Are they going to have very discrete rules with different countries depending on who they are, which would be very, very difficult to administer? Or are they going to have general rates of import, which is, in my opinion, more likely because it's simpler to administrate, right? And the administration of this is really tough. But beyond that, the impact to various countries is, can be significant. As a Canadian, I'm very sensitive to what is going on and how these, what the discussions potentially are happening and what the various scenarios are, because Canada is the US's largest trading partner, and lots of very significant goods, and the bulk of the Canadian economy is oriented around trade with the United States. And these tariffs, especially, you have steel and aluminum, which are fall under 232. And it's not just steel and aluminum, it's steel and aluminum and derivatives, which makes things very complicated. And then you have you have USMCA, which is hanging in the balance. So that's the automotive industry and other goods. My wife, for instance, works for a Canadian cookie manufacturer. Historically, they have been able to sell into the United States duty free. If they are going to be subject to a 25% duty on the goods that they export from Canada and import into the United States, that business is going to die. They will not be competitive, right? And so I've got, one of my very good friends is in the oatmeal business, sells oatmeal to the United States. Again, historically, that's been 0%. If it's 25%, that becomes uncompetitive. And so it really is virtually every sector of the Canadian economy is highly dependent on being able to trade with the United States. And these duties are going to have significant impacts. And so we're in this holding pattern today, waiting for April 2nd. And you're exactly right that probably the Canadian government and the US government are having negotiations behind the scenes as to what will happen on April 2nd. And I think it's anybody's guess. You have different signs coming out from, the Premier of Ontario or the Premier of Alberta, and some government officials in the US that are part of these that say things are positive. But what does that mean? I don't know that anybody knows what that really means.
You know what's funny? We brought up the cars, and I truly hate bringing my opinion in here, but because it's my opinion, it's not anyone else's opinion. Okay. So whatever I'm saying, don't take it to heart. But I think of cars, and I'm like, when he does the reciprocal tariffs, and I'm thinking, well, Germany's cars are much better. So why would we want your cars imported into our country? I mean, that's why they're taxed so high. But that's just like a silly thinking of mine. I'm like, because Germany is going to be very much impacted if they get reciprocal tariffs happening on their cars, because that's what we export, right?
Yeah, your comment is not altogether.
It's wrong. I want it to be so. I want there to be like the U.S. should tax this, have the same tariffs on what Germany does. I understand that. I totally agree with it.
Like, the answer is it's complicated, right? And it's easy to say. Well, it would be fair is if there's a 10% duty on cars going into Europe, it should be 10% of European cars going into the United States. Okay, but let's take a different example that sort of highlights things, maybe a little bit differently, right? So in Canada, for instance, we have what we call the Dairy Board. it basically is centralized supply management of Canada's dairy farmers that guarantees sort of a price. It's like an elevated price that enables confidence, or it's more than confidence, just consistent sale price of milk, such that dairy farmers in Canada are able to compete. And then we have a quota system with the United States, whereby only, there's so much milk that can be imported from the United States into Canada, and from other regions for that matter, to ensure that the dairy farmers don't get destroyed. It really is a protectionist act to save the Canadian dairy farm. Okay. So, this is one of Trump's big things, is like, well, this is unfair. Okay. But the problem is in this instance, and it does apply to far reaching points in the global economy, is that the Canadian government has said, and I don't know that they're wrong, is that the Canadian dairy economy, or that it's important for the Canadian economy to have its own dairy farm, to be able to produce its own milk, and that's like a security thing, right? We can't be reliant on other countries to produce milk for us. Okay, well, so the U.S. is 10 times our size and has more than 10 times our the number of dairy farmers. And if it was truly free and open trade, the U.S. would otherwise be able to virtually destroy the Canadian dairy market, right? Or dairy production, right? Okay, so it's clear that Canada has protectionist rules to protect the dairy farm. And from a objective perspective, one might say that, well, every country has the right to decide what is strategic for them from a security perspective to maintain internally, and that maybe it's okay for Canada to have the dairy market board, but the U.S. doesn't need something like that. But it would also be fair to say that U.S. chip manufacturing, for instance, computer chips, is a national security interest for the United States, and that is not sort of a concern of Canada. Or even if it were a concern, could you really have a chip manufacturing sector and be competitive globally? And the answer is probably not, right? So every country is different and has a certain set of things that they'd like to protect. And I think that it's fair to say that that different countries ought to be able to have what they believe is in their security's best interests and have protection around those things. And then for the other stuff, you would want fair trade. And that makes things very complicated and very nuanced. And my point, coming back to the automotive sector, is really around, maybe the automotive sector is so important to Europe that it needs to, or to Germany in particular, that it needs to be protected, right? Now, the US would also argue, but that's not fair because it's actually in their interest too. And Canada would argue that it's in our best interest as well. And that creates complexity and it creates a complicated discussion, right?
Well, I'm coming back to America's first agenda, right? Every country kind of has their own agenda. But again, you can't be limited. You can't enclose yourself either.
Every country has its own concerns that are unique.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Germany happens to be positioned in Europe that has it has a history, and B, it has geopolitical concerns that are different. The U.S., Canada, and Mexico are very lucky in that we happen to be situated in a place that is surrounded by ocean and Arctic, and it's virtually impossible to get here without getting on a plane or going on a long voyage. The skid marks that are left by anybody trying to come into this, our sphere, is massive. In Europe, you don't have any of that, and you don't have any of those concerns. And so to think that the countries would be equivalent, Canada has a population of 40 million. We're the second largest landmass in the world. Our concerns are going to be very different than the U.S. that has 375 million people in a much more constrained landmass. So everything's different, and to think that everything has to be treated the same is not as nuanced a look as we really need in this global world.
I'm going to bring up China which was my favorite topic last year. Not. So, the tariffs have been pretty nice on not and nice, I mean, in a funny way, because it's not nice at all. They have been doubled from 10 to 20 as of March 4th. And so China's kind of not a great trading partner right now for the US. And therefore, there's other countries who seem to come up, India being one of them. And I've heard it a couple of times at ICPA too, which I talked to Cinemark that one of their trading partners is India. I think they get their rugs from India, which is so interesting. You sit in the movies now and I'm like, hey, did you know this rug's from India? And I'm like, why is this something I need to be discussing with my friends? How do you see India becoming a huge factor or trading partner with Canada or the US?
The opportunity with India is just substantial. And they have a very, very good high tech sector. They are very Western inclined. Their problem is not dissimilar to the problem that China has, which is that for India to become a real world player, they need energy. And so for an economy the size of India, the amount of energy they need we can imagine is just almost infinite. And the issue that, America has and most of the West has with India, and India coming into the fold of sort of Western nations, really is their sourcing of energy and where they get their energy from. And basically they've said, because our demand is virtually infinite, we will take it from all comers, and that includes Russia and Iran. And so as Iran and Russia are embargoed in the West, this creates a real problem for India. And there's always sort of this underlying talk of, will India ever have a trade agreement with Western nations, or specifically the United States? I don't know that the US is going to be able to sign a trade agreement with India under the circumstances that they're sourcing energy from Iran and Russia, at least under the current scenario. Because there is no way that the West is able to supply India with the energy that is required. And so, this represents a problem. But there are things that are happening in the geopolitical world that are going to solve potentially some of these problems. We live in interesting times, and things are happening so fast, notwithstanding that we're in a dead period right now, as you said, waiting for our April 2nd to roll around. I think what's really happening is that there's no new news, but people are planning and trying to wrap their heads around where we stand in the new American sort of posture, and it's creating very, very much uncertainty, which is very painful for a lot of people.
Yeah. No, I mean, 100%. And thank you for that. Trade wars are crazy. I mean, that's kind of what we're in right now. I don't even want to use the term because war sounds so intense, but essentially we are.
No, this is a trade war. There's no doubt. This is a trade war, and it is intense, and it is, bullets aren't flying, but threats are being made, and it has real consequence, right? So, listen, I was on a podcast a couple days ago with Jim Tompkins from Tompkins Ventures, and he said, he has a friend that called him, and he's a manufacturer in the United States. He manufactures, I don't even know what it is, but he consumes aluminum, and most of that aluminum comes from Canada, and that basically, I think it's $150 million company a year, something like that, which isn't a small company. It's not a massive company, but his import duty bill will be $7 million, and he cannot afford a tariff, like a bill, an incremental bill in his business of $7 million, and he's really stressed about it. So it's not just a Canadian thing, and it's not just a global thing outside of the United States. The Americans are going to be hit very severely, and it's trying to come to terms with what the consequences are is not easy. And the answer likely is that a certain set of businesses are going to go out of business and a certain set of new businesses are going to come and be generated from the turmoil. But ultimately there are going to be winners and losers, on a microcosm, and that's going to be painful.
Yeah. I mean, analysts, doing some research, analysts have predicted that the US GDP will flatline, like within the half of 2025. So we'll see if that happens. I mean, there's so much to come. There's always so much talk, and there's different, we cannot predict anything really at this moment because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow again. And that's why I do want to mention that some of these things that we're saying right now might have changed on Monday when this episode comes out, because we're recording this 3 days before, but in 3 days, that's like a year in the trade industry right now. I do want to mention one thing before, because I think it's not said enough. So 2 years ago, we had forced labor being one of the hottest topics. And when I research it, first off, nothing in the news, but if you go deeper, I mean, of course, there's still, CBP is still trying to get it out and trying to inform people that, look, we're here and we're making these enforcements. And there's an indication of increased enforcement efforts related to forced labor right now. So it is something I just want to mention that you need to take care of. And if your team is not trained, they need to get the training, whether it's an e-learning and a webinar, seminar, whatever is out there. Check it out, because you need to be good with forced labor, because let's say you get hit with forced labor and with tariffs, and you're going to be out of business like by tomorrow.
Yeah. So I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. It falls into a slightly larger rubric, which would be understanding your business and your supply chain, not just who you trade with, but who they trade with as well, and what that value chain ultimately looks like. What you need to know is that CBP and other governmental agencies in the United States have, especially with the advent of AI and large data models, have acquired a certain set of tools that are able to analyze their massive amounts of data, trade data from ACE. And they know a heck of a lot more than you do about your supply chain. And there are a certain set of tools that you have on this, forced labor in particular, that could be useful. I'll call out two companies, if I can here, if you're interested. Altana is one and Sayari is another. And that, what you need to do is get a better handle on your trading partners. But beyond that, what you really need is to get a better handle on your supply chain more generally. And it's not just your trading partners, but it's what is happening with your supply chain, or how do you operate your supply chain? How do you understand the data that gets generated? There is almost an infinite amount of data that your supply chain is generating that is useful to you and your business. And that's where, a company like Third Wave, that's what we do, right? We help companies, manage and operationalize their international trade. But we are living in a time today where it is not a choice anymore, whether or not you have control and understanding of your international supply chain. If you want to play in an international supply chain world, you need to have control of your process and your data, and be able to change and evolve as the regulations change. And God knows we are in a period of massive change and massive uncertainty, and you can't make decisions within your business if you don't have that information.
So at ICPA, it's funny because you make friends, and I made a friend. And one thing I ask her here and there, I'm like, what are some of the things you're dealing with right now? And she's like, she's a lawyer. Country of origin. Country of origin is one of the biggest things that is companies are struggling with right now. And it goes back to the tariffs. It goes back to, international trade. It goes back to supply chain, kind of connecting everything we just talked about. Again, thank you so much for listening. And please follow us on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you want, really. And let us know what you think and what your questions are, because I know you have questions. So just ask. Again, thank you so much, Grant, for coming on. I appreciate it. And we'll probably see you soon again. And you guys have a great week. Bye.
Well, thanks a lot. See ya.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at SimplyTradePod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.